Okay, I think I'm going to kick things off. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jeff Hulstrung. I'm the president of the Green Mountain Audubon Society, a chapter of the National Audubon Society covering Franklin, Grand Isle, and Chittenden counties in Vermont. And this is the last time that you will hear me say that, as I am relocating and stepping down as president. Pat Phillips, my dear friend and fellow board member, has generously agreed to take over as president, and Lucy Lehman will take over as vice president. It has been my honor and my pleasure to serve the board, the membership, and the community of the Green Mountain Audubon Society for the past 5 years. Our all-volunteer organization continues to thrive thanks to the dedication of board members and the strong support from our members and our community. Thank you all for being part of something wonderful which serves our natural community and our human community. Our chapter is based in northwestern Vermont, a region which has been sacred to Indigenous people for thousands of years. The Western Abenaki are the traditional caretakers of these lands and waters. We respect their connection to this region and remember the hardships they continue to endure. We give thanks for the opportunity to share this place, and we commit to help protecting it. And with that, I will turn it over to my fellow board member, Liza Morse.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. As Jeff just said, my name is Liza Morse. I'm a fellow board member at the Green Mountain Audubon Society and part of the programs committee. And on behalf of our small but mighty programs committee, we are very happy to welcome Hyla back. If you didn't get a chance to attend her talk last year, that is up on our YouTube channel. It was wonderful about her research at the University of Vermont. And tonight, she puts on a new hat as the Grassland Bird Biologist for Mass Audubon. So I will just read a little bio about Hyla, and then she will kick it off. Just to orient everyone, we will do about 45 minutes of presentation, at which time or during which time you can ask any questions you may have for Hyla in the chat. We will not interrupt her with those questions unless they are truly burning on fire questions that must be answered right away. But otherwise, we'll wait till the end, and then Jeff and myself will communicate those to Hyla, and she will do her best to answer them. So with that, Hyla Howe grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but has called the North Country home since 2015. Witnessing farmland loss in the landscape of her childhood inspired Hyla to pursue a career path that blends community outreach, wildlife conservation, and farming. Hyla lived in the Adirondacks for many years, where she worked as an environmental educator, wildlife researcher, and flower farmer. She served as a board member for Northern New York Audubon Society from 2020 to 2024, where she founded and piloted their farm grant program. Hyla moved to Vermont in 2022 to study grassland birds and hayfield management practices, and earned her master's degree in natural resources at the University of Vermont with Dr. Alan Strong. She now lives in Milton, Vermont, and works as a grassland bird biologist for Mass Audubon, where she is coordinating the Bobolink Project. And with that, Hyla, take it away. Oh, are you not? Sorry, I muted everyone.
I made the mistake of muting myself, and then I guess I couldn't unmute.
No worries, we got you. Thank you.
And could you also turn my sharing on again?
Sorry, y'all. Tech issues. Can you request to share?
It just says, no, it says it's not turned on.
Okay, hold on a second. This is what we get for our first try again.
Right now.
Nope. Still not working. Sorry for the delay, everyone.
Okay, try again.
Okay, awesome. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, looks lovely.
Perfect. Okay, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for having me back. as Liza said, my name is Hyla Howe. I'm a grassland bird biologist with Mass Audubon Society, but I actually still live in the Burlington area. And tonight we're going to talk about the Bobolink Project, kind of where the project stands now and how we're planning to move forward in some really exciting ways. So I'm glad that you've all joined us. All right. You might recognize me from the presentation that I gave last March, which was about my graduate research. It focused on grassland conservation in the Adirondacks. And since then, I successfully defended my thesis, and I started in this position at the end of July. And it was interesting, as I was making this presentation, I was reflecting back on that one that I gave in March. And a lot of the questions at the end were actually about the Bobolink Project. And I kept saying, you know, I'm not a representative of this program, but kind of sharing what I knew. And that really now kind of feels like foreshadowing. It really goes to show how widely known this program is in our region. And I'm just so grateful to be in this position and, you know, have the ability to really continue a lot of the work that I started in this area with grassland bird conservation in my research. It's a really exciting time to be a part of this program because it's a time of growth and change. So over the next 45 minutes, I'll just take you along and show you what I've learned in my first few months on the job. And, you know, kind of what we've learned over the last 10 years of the program, and hopefully inspire you to join us as we move forward. So when we talk about grassland birds, the three species that I'm really going to talk about today are savanna sparrow, bobolink, and eastern meadowlark. That's because they're all relatively widespread in Vermont. So that makes it fairly easy to collect data to show the impacts that suggested management timelines are having on them. These three species also cohabitate in open habitats, and all three are facing pretty significant declines. Bobolinks in particular have lost 68% of their population in the last 50 years. And in the same amount of time, we've lost 3 out of 4 meadowlarks. Meadowlarks are now listed in Vermont. And while our program is called the Bobolink Project, bobolinks really are used as kind of a charismatic umbrella species because efforts to protect them also benefit these other 2 species and countless others as well. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this graph. I won't spend too much time on it because it's not really fun, but grassland species have declined more than birds in any other habitat type over the last 50 years. So they've had a larger proportional decline in population than in any other habitat. And this is due to extensive disturbance and habitat loss in both native and human managed grasslands, which includes the tilling of the Great Plains, the development and reforestation of hayfields in the Northeast, and just the general intensification of haying on our remaining ag lands. So they're really just kind of being pushed from all sides. They're losing, you know, natural habitat, and they're also kind of being pushed out of a lot of agricultural lands as those lands are developed and lost and intensified. All in all, we have lost 53% of our grassland bird population in the US and Canada in the last 50 years, which equates to 700 million individuals of 31 species. And as you can see on the bottom right with that red arrow, that's just showing the proportion of the species that are declining, and it's showing that grasslands are suffering really the most. So that's kind of, and this is all coming from the Rosenberg paper that was published in 2019, that really inspired a lot of, you know, conservation work to protect grassland birds around the country and in New England. So, you know, we're pretty concerned about their long-term resilience, but there's a lot of hope and a lot of room to grow. So as the name suggests, grassland species breed in these large open habitats. They evolved in the natural open habitats like the Great Plains and the coastal prairies, but they easily adapted to breeding in hayfields. You know, as the native prairies were tilled and as the coastal prairies were developed, the Northeast was being logged and really converted into pasture land. And so they breed really successfully here because hayfields in the Northeast actually pretty closely replicate the vegetation structure of the native prairie that they were originally nesting in. And disturbance has always been necessary to prevent woody encroachment in grass-dominated habitats. But the haying that now maintains these open lands often happens during the breeding season, which results in really high mortality of nestlings. So grassland species, especially these grassland songbirds that we're talking about, they build their nests on the ground under the cover of forbs. So when haying occurs during the breeding season, they're just incredibly vulnerable. And there's a lot of nest failure and mortality just due to being exposed to predators, actual, trauma from the haying operation itself. And unfortunately, hay harvests often do coincide with periods of the breeding season when there are eggs or flightless young in the nest. So this happens because the nutritional content of forage peaks in early summer and then rapidly declines. So farmers who are trying to feed livestock and sell high quality hay to their customers really need to get into their fields at the same time that grassland birds need for them to stay out of the fields, which is kind of the root of the problem of grassland bird conservation in Vermont and in this region. When we think about the breeding season, it usually begins, bobolinks will start arriving in May. They'll start looking for places to nest in late May, and then it can really stretch the whole way through mid-July. But this graph, I think, is a great demonstration. This was from Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and it shows kind of the phenology of breeding behavior throughout the breeding season. So you can see that the core of the breeding season, when there are, young in the nest or eggs in the nest, is really all of June and the first week of July. So that's when we most want farmers to be staying out of the fields. And of course, even once young have fledged, it does take them a little bit of time to grow strong enough to be able to evade the tractor. So there's kind of a period in there where, we're really trying to nail down the exact dates that farmers can hay without really disrupting breeding birds. But many farmers complete their first hay harvest in mid to late May, and then they can harvest each field up to 4 times a season. And it's worth noting there are often significant financial implications of delayed haying. And weather windows add a layer of unpredictability to the season, which causes farmers to really want to get hay harvest when they can. Thinking back to the last few summers, it'll be these long, beautiful stretches of nice weather, and then we'll have the weather shift and it'll rain for months, or it'll rain, periodically enough that the hay just never dries out. And so it's really a large ask to ask farmers to delay, because they're not guaranteed to be able to cut on any certain date at any point in the summer. So Alan Strong, Noah Perlett, and Toby Alexander conducted research back in 2011 that essentially laid the groundwork for the Bobolink Project. They wanted to know if there were haying timelines that would be feasible for farmers, and that would also allow birds to fledge from the fields. So they did some research in the Champlain Valley, and they came up with 2 timelines that farmers theoretically could use. The first they called a delayed first cut, where farmers delayed the first cut on their field until there was basically no chance of having any lingering nests. So that timeline was a no-mow window between May 18th and August 1st. The second was a delayed second cut, where farmers were able to take an early cut in May. The idea here was that it would be before bobolinks have fully established in the field, so they haven't spent too much time and energy and investment nesting in that field. And then the farmer would have to wait for 65 days because that was determined to be an adequate amount of time for bobolinks to return to fields and safely complete their nesting cycle. So that one was a no-mow window from June 1st through August 5th or August 15th. Once they identified these two timelines, the next question was, what would it take to get farmers to follow these timelines? And this was essentially when the Bobolink Project was born. It began as an economic research question that examined the feasibility of this model that connected conservation-minded donors with conservation-minded farmers in an attempt to buy time for nesting birds. So the program basically came up with a framework where they solicited donations from birders like yourselves, and they distributed those funds directly to farmers who were delaying the hay harvest on their fields. It was this really cool community-funded idea that really was pretty successful. So the program is now fiscally sponsored by Mass Audubon, and we partner very closely with Audubon Vermont, New Hampshire Audubon, and with Alan Strong at the University of Vermont. So it's a very collaborative effort. And the program's model really hasn't changed much since it began in 2013. It's fairly simple, but it has been really successful. And the program has grown steadily in both fundraising and acreage. One of the interesting things that's changed now is that they never had a dedicated staff member. And so after, over 10 years, the program finally had the funding to hire a dedicated full-time staff member, and I'm lucky enough to be that person. So this really adds a lot of capacity to the program. I'm constantly amazed by the growth that it saw without someone dedicating full-time effort to it. But the program always used a reverse bid fixed price model to select fields, which meant that everyone got the same amount per acre, but that those who bid the lowest were at the front of the line. So it was seen as a way to set an equal price for everyone that was driven by the market. And we used one-year contracts that allow more flexibility than other programs, although many of the farmers in our program have been enrolled for 5+ years. Some have even been enrolled for the whole duration of the program. We do require that fields must be at least 20 acres in size and have breeding bobolinks in them. The 20-acre minimum is kind of just a standard that's been set through a lot of research. Bobolinks and other grassland species, they will increase in abundance and in diversity of species the larger that fields are. So our 20-acre minimum ensures that it won't just house, one pair of bobolinks, but it'll be a field that could sustain, hopefully, a healthy population. And our Bobolink Project partners help to monitor fields every year. We haven't always gotten to every single field, but we do our best. And this helps us to basically monitor the breeding bobolinks and monitor trends over time. And when we're in the field, we record the number of females, and we use those numbers to estimate the number of fledglings that each field produces. So that's always kind of a healthy metric for us to be using. In 2024, we were able to enroll 1,395 acres at a cost of $50 per acre. Our bid prices ranged from $1 to $50, but everyone got $50. And the average field size was 45 acres, but we had bids that ranged between 15 and 150. And almost, or I guess a little over, no, it looks like just almost, 3/4 of our farms are enrolled in the delayed first cut timeline, which means that they're just not touching their fields before August 1st. So they're trying to take, one cut during the season, but they want that cut to be earlier. They don't want to have to wait until the middle of August. Liza, are there any pressing questions just while I'm taking a break, drinking my tea?
I think we should keep going to the end because I think the questions will steer us in a different direction.
Okay, perfect. So this is the map of all of our fields in 2024. Our enrolled farms cover 4 states, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, and New York. But the majority of our farms are in Vermont, particularly in the southern Champlain Valley, Addison County area. And to address the elephant in the room, we have nothing against the state of New Hampshire. We just didn't have anyone apply. So if you have any friends in New Hampshire that have hayfields over 20 acres in size, you should let them know about us.
Actually, I'll interrupt you
Yeah.
because there was a question actually about the Bobolink Project in Connecticut. The question was, I understand that the Bobolink Project began in Connecticut. What is the possibility that it could return to Connecticut?
Yeah, so we don't really have a boundary that we can't extend beyond. I think as long as a farm met the qualifications, and I'll talk a little bit later too about changes that we're implementing, and especially how we're going to prioritize fields moving forward. But the answer is, maybe yes. Some things we would consider are, whether we have partners in that area that could do the monitoring. Of course, our headquarters are in Lincoln and we have Mass Audubon staff throughout the state. So I'm sure, depending on where the field was located, we might be able to have a staff member go down there, or maybe have a partnering organization who could check in on that property. We did have a field apply from Wisconsin this year, and we had to turn them down just because it was so far from where we are. But I would say tentatively yes to the Connecticut field.
And they're
right that it did start in Connecticut.
The other question was about whether or not there were options for publicly owned, say, town-owned fields as well.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely an option. We are excited to partner with different stakeholders. We're kind of figuring out what that looks like right now. We're moving in a direction of having more flexibility and deeper partnerships. So, I don't know if that field would be funded through our normal channel, but it could be something that we could, partner on and maybe find another grant for. So I would tell that person to definitely reach out, and I would love to talk with them.
Great. That's it for questions related to geography.
Awesome. Those are good questions. Thank you. So, yeah, our acreage has increased pretty steadily. When we started in 2013, we started with 250 acres. The next year we had 350 acres. We're now up to 1,395, as I mentioned earlier. And as we've been increasing the acreage, our fundraising has really kept up, which is a huge part of this. And we set really ambitious goals for next year. And we're hoping to double the acreage just through conducting more outreach. And luckily we have a grant that is supporting some of this growth over the next year. So that's really exciting. It's a huge goal, and it'll be cool to see if we can meet it, or how close we can get to that. So if you're thinking right about now that this all sounds great, we have it all figured out, this must be the end of the story, you're slightly mistaken. Over the last 10 years, we've had the ability to really watch these fields, read new literature that's coming out, and talk with partners across the region to kind of share notes with people that are trying similar strategies. And we've learned a lot. I've learned a lot just in my first few months. I could probably talk about this for like a week straight. But we found that our model really works. It's scalable, but it really needs to be adjusted. There are a lot of factors that are kind of complicating this issue. Among others, we have the consideration of climate change and how that will impact the timing of birds and the timing of hay harvests and the financial constraints that farmers are under. So we're kind of adapting now just based on what we've learned over the last 10 years, but with the humble realization that this program will always be adapting. And these things, hay harvests and birds that we're kind of trying to find common ground between, they're always going to be shifting. And so that just keeps us on our toes and keeps it exciting. But we found that this model really, it works. But some things that need to be tweaked are, the $50 an acre that we've kind of settled on over the last few years really just is not sufficient to meet the needs of a lot of producers. It even goes as far to exclude some producers, which is especially true for dairy farmers. I think there are a lot of folks that are no longer applying to the program because they know that it's just not going to work with their farm budget. We've also seen bobolink abundance start to dip in some of the fields that have been enrolled in the program for the longest, which brings up the question, does delayed haying cause these declines, or are we capturing in real time the declining trends that we're all aware of, that we started this presentation talking about? And this led us to examine how we can support farmers more holistically. It led us to identify areas of research that, still remain, answers that we still need. And we really want to make sure that grassland bird conservation makes sense for farmers and for everyone involved, and leads to better long-term outcomes for the birds. So the first piece of this puzzle is field quality. This hayfield, looking at it, it's a pretty healthy hayfield. There's a good composition of grasses and what we call forbs, which are non-woody, non-grass plants like legumes and wildflowers. This field in particular, when I took this picture, was full of bobolinks. It had at least one nesting eastern meadowlark. And I also heard a grasshopper sparrow while I was biking by this farm, but I wasn't able to confirm whether it was breeding. And a few factors that make this field a high quality field is that it's large. It doesn't have too many trees or hedgerows to fragment, the openness. It's also surrounded by other hayfields, so it's located in a fairly open landscape. And finally, the composition of grasses to forbs is ideal for bobolinks. They tend to forage in the grasses and then nest under the forbs because grasses just have more insects in them. They're taller, so they kind of have different stratum that, house different types of insects. And so there's just more diversity in the grasses, but the forbs provide more nesting cover. So they really need both. And so unfortunately for grassland species, the intensively managed hayfields like this one tend to be the most attractive fields because they're large, they have healthy grass, but they also become ecological traps because birds choose to nest there and then their nests fail due to haying. So I have a quick quiz for you. Not all hayfields are created equal, and it's kind of hard to tell the difference sometimes between what a high quality hayfield or a field that, you know, might look good when you're driving by, but actually not have as many bobolinks in it. So 2 of these fields have vegetation concerns that I see right away. And if you could just, I'll take a minute. I'd love to hear your guesses for which fields have vegetation concerns. So you can put those in the chat. And Liza, you can like shout it out when you see some of the answers. I can't actually see the chat right
Yeah,
now.
so two voted for A and C, and one person just said wild parsnip. And one person said wild parsnip and woody growth. We have some smart people on this call.
Yeah, they nailed it. Good job. So yeah, basically the field on the left has poison parsnip that's starting to encroach from the edges, and the field on the right has woody encroachment. So they totally nailed it. So what happens when a field isn't hayed for production is you start to see these 2 things start to happen. So when farmers commit to delaying haying on their property, I've heard them refer to the field as the bobolink field or the set-aside field because they aren't getting a profitable harvest from it. And in their mind, this field is serving bobolinks. And that field becomes the lowest priority for haying because they're being told to set it aside. So they get to it last. Sometimes they get to it as late as early fall. They might not get to it at all every year. And they often also stop fertilizing it because it doesn't make sense to pay for fertilizer on a crop that you aren't really harvesting. So when fields are no longer fertilized and when haying happens so late that forbs go to seed, the forbs start to get a competitive advantage in the field. And we start to see these shifts in vegetation composition that actually are detrimental to birds like bobolinks and eastern meadowlarks. So field A has an invasion of poison parsnip. That's a concern because it's toxic to a lot of livestock. It really decreases the forage quality. It's actually the one that if you touch it and you get the oils on your skin and then you're in the sun, it'll burn you. So when that starts to encroach in a field, farmers really don't want that hay. Poison parsnip actually is not as bad as some other plants for birds, but it's really just bad for the long-term health and management of the field. And then C has woody encroachment, which makes me think that this field might not be hayed every year, which can lead to changes in soil health. And it also shows that the edges are likely filling in, which is shrinking the size of the field over time. And so an issue that's come onto our radar is this issue of invasive species. And I put quotes around it because I'm acknowledging that a lot of the species of grass in these hayfields are also non-native. But when we talk about invasive species, they're basically plants that are problematic for one or both, forage quality and habitat quality. And we often see these plants move in from the margins and kind of overtake fields that are not being fertilized and that are being delayed later. So we recognize that the problems associated with these species are often exacerbated by the delayed mowing. And on the left, that is a bobolink sitting in a beautiful patch of spotted knapweed. And then on the right, there's a bobolink likely foraging in some smooth bed straw. And while these birds both look happy and they may be able to forage and feed in these plants, they really don't offer the cover that grasses do. So the birds won't be able to build their nests here. So in talking with farmers and talking with other conservation professionals across the state, we decided to adjust our haying timelines that, we're adjusting it for this upcoming season for two reasons. The first is that the earlier farmers can hay, the less of a financial burden the program will cause. And second, the earlier they can hay, the greater the chance that they'll be able to knock back some of these weeds and maintain their field quality, which will lead to harvests that aren't as delayed in the future. So the delayed first cut timeline was shifted forward because breeding should be completed on fields that have never been disturbed by the middle of July. And some of these fields, we've even seen bobolinks, and some of our partners in Maine have seen bobolinks fledging as early as July 4th from fields. So this gives farmers 2 additional weeks, which really is significant at this time of the year. And so that's been shifted from the no mow window of May 18th to August 1st to just the first cut happening July 15th. And then the delayed second cut was really interesting. We had pretty mixed results with this one. It works incredibly well in some places, but there were a few too many fields where we just didn't see that bobolinks returned after they were disturbed. And we determined that on the fields where this worked, they were often hayed before May 20th. So the disturbance happened not just before there were eggs in the nest, but before the birds had even really started to consider the fields at all. And so once they were disturbed after they had kind of started establishing, the risk was just too high that they wouldn't come back. So starting the no-mow window on May 20th will hopefully alleviate that problem. And then we're still allowing for a 65-day window from that date, which brought us to July 24th, which is about 3 weeks earlier than the previous version. And we're also adding a clause to the contract that allows fields to be cleared earlier if a member of our program comes out and says that it's safe. So as I said earlier, the majority of our farmers are enrolled in the delayed first cut. This is really recommended for most people. This is the timeline, that's just the lowest risk to the largest number of grassland species because meadowlarks do nest earlier. So this protects them and other species as well. The delayed second cut, we would really only recommend for well-drained soils. This might be more suited for dairy farmers. We'd also recommend it for anyone that has meadowlarks. And we would also recommend it for folks that have some invasive species concerns because we think that this might allow them to knock back those plants and then hopefully delay the plants going to seed until later in the season. So I mentioned earlier that the $50 compensation is really not enough for a lot of folks. And this is because there are just such a wide range of people that manage and own hayfields. So when we think about compensation, we realized that the fixed price bidding scheme just didn't adequately address the needs of different types of farmers and landowners. So dairy livestock have the highest nutritional requirements. And so dairy farmers will have the tightest margins and need the most support, whereas a landowner who's not reliant on their land for their livelihood might have a lot more flexibility. And I think, you know, previously the cost of buying time was kind of supposed to offset the cost of hay. But when I really started looking into it, I realized that the true cost of implementing management for grassland birds, which includes fertilization of the fields and reliable haying, is so much higher. So it was really interesting to kind of think about all of the things that should be factored into the true cost per acre of this management. And I just made this slide to show how even just splitting between farmers and landowners, how those costs can really differ. And, you know, due to the fixed price reverse auction bid, it actually, I don't understand why, because I'm not an economist, but it actually drove the price down over the duration of the program. So we started out with higher compensation rates. And this is driven by the market of people that are applying, but I think that people were dropping off as the price went down and they stopped applying. So we basically plateaued at around $50 an acre back in 2019, and it stayed essentially the same since. But we've decided this year that instead of doing this, we're just going to take bids at their value. And instead of accepting the fields that bid the lowest amount first, we're going to prioritize high value, high quality fields and pay those folks what they need in order to sustainably manage their fields for grassland species. So this looks like, you know, implementing a prioritization rubric. So it really identifies the highest value fields, and that will move those fields to the front of the list. So the highest quality fields are large fields within open landscapes that have breeding bobolinks and meadowlarks and have healthy vegetation composition and very few invasive species concerns. And going along with the changes that we're making, we're also really investing more time in education and technical support for the farmers in the program. It was always historically a financial incentive program. And given the fact that the program didn't have a designated full-time staff member, they just really didn't have the capacity to provide opportunities, you know, for farmers to connect and to provide more one-on-one support. So we're really excited that this is a way that we can really grow. And we want to create more opportunities for farmers in the program to connect with each other, to visit new farms, and to learn from experts in the field. So as an example, earlier this month, I co-hosted an event with the dairy manager at Shelburne Farms, and we talked to participants of our program about livestock rotations, vegetation management, and soil amendments that can improve habitat quality for grassland species. And we're also planning to host an annual meeting starting next fall so that donors, volunteers, and farmers can all connect with each other. We want this to be more of a community, so folks aren't all just in their own bubble, but they're aware of what's happening on other farms and just being able to connect with like-minded people in their community. And we're also really involved regionally in some of these conversations. And it's really important for us because just like we want farmers to be connecting with each other so they know kind of what other people are trying on their farms, it's so important for us to be aware of other organizations that are running into similar challenges to the ones that we are. And we also think that this could be a way to really scale our work by having partners that can help us with monitoring or help us to provide better technical support. So we have a lot of great partners already, but that's something that I've really been diving into in my first few months, really reaching out to other folks and just connecting and making sure that we're showing up in these regional meetings. So this picture was from the Northeast Bird Habitat Conservation Initiative meeting that happened in Dorset in September, and I was able to present about the program and about our work with regional conservation partnerships that we're collaborating with in the Metro West area of Boston and also in the Mid-Champlain area. And so to kind of put some focus towards this growth that we're planning, we identified focal areas, and then we kind of identified focal areas within the focal areas where we can focus our outreach and recruitment and fundraising. And this map on the left shows, it's basically a heat map for bobolink abundance. So the red areas and the orange areas have a lot of high quality habitat for grassland species. We already have a lot of farms enrolled in the southern Champlain Valley, so this makes a lot of sense as a place for us to really focus on. But we are also looking forward to focusing more effort up in the Franklin, Grand Isle County areas. As Liza mentioned, I'm based up in Milton, so hoping we can expand up in that direction because there's a lot of really high quality habitat up there. And then we've also identified areas in the Connecticut River watershed where we have partnering organizations and where there seem to be smaller patches of habitat that could be really valuable. And one of the things that we're thinking about is kind of this neighborhood model, really trying to be diligent about, our capacity, our partners' capacity, and just, the ecological reality of the fact that the more farms you can have that are within, a couple kilometers of each other, the easier it is for us to monitor them, the lower the environmental impact of us getting to them, and the better it is for birds. So we're really trying to expand kind of out from the farms that we already have, and particularly in these areas that we've identified as being really valuable. And we don't have a good representation of, farms in all of these areas, but especially in the southern Champlain Valley, there's so much potential to really kind of use that neighborhood model. So I think the big picture of all of this is really moving away from a more narrow focused financial incentive program and moving towards kind of a more holistic, bigger picture work in progress of just really trying to connect grassland bird conservation with efforts to strengthen local food systems, implement climate resilient farm management practices, and just support local farms. So it's really interesting how grassland bird conservation connects to soil health and to rural economics and to social science research, climate resilience, forage quality. All of these things are kind of circulating and being talked about and are important to incorporate into our work moving forward. So there are a lot of ways to help with this work. We would love to have more volunteers to help with outreach and monitoring and field vetting. Like I said, we're hoping to have a lot more fields enrolled this coming season. So we're actually opening our enrollment period this year earlier. We're opening it on November 1st, and it'll be open until March 31st. So that gives us a lot of time to talk with the folks that are applying to the program and hopefully do some vetting, but nothing can replace the knowledge of birders that know their own town and know where the bobolinks are. So it would be immensely helpful for us to connect with birders that know where bobolinks are and maybe have connections with some of those farmers. Donations really help to fund this work. So
Awesome. I was just trying to grab your email so I could, oh, but it's on there. Never mind.
Yeah, so feel free to contact us. And that's my work phone number and my work email. So if you want to reach me, any of those work.
Lovely. So we have quite a few questions, so I'll try to run through those. But first, since I have the mic, I'm going to ask you a question of my own, which perhaps other people had. I want to clarify, when you say the timeline for a first cut and a second cut option, those were those timelines where one option is a farmer or landowner is just cutting once in the course of the whole season, and the second option they're cutting twice?
Yeah, so I mean, people can cut, especially in Vermont. You can get, you know, hay harvest in September. So I would say with the July 15th date, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would only be able to get one cut. We're just saying that you can't disturb the field before the middle of July, because we want to make sure that if we're, you know, bringing the date up that far, we want to make sure that bobolinks and meadowlarks have had, you know, really the full season to complete their nesting cycle. Whereas the delayed second cut, they should be able to get a cut in early May, depending on where they are geographically and depending on their fields. So that one allows people to basically get a low volume, high quality cut early in the season, and then delay that second cut to, you know, the later end of July.
Got it. And someone asked, are these timelines used for all of New England, or do they vary geographically?
So these are the timelines that we're going forward with our contracts for this year. So that'll cover all the farms in the program, but with the caveat of we're going to have a clause in the contracts that say that we can clear fields early. So we'll prioritize fields that, or, you know, farms that have either forage quality or invasive species concerns. So it's not a guarantee that we will be able to get to everyone, but if, you know, we know that folks really would like to be able to hay earlier, we will do our best to get to those fields and assess, you know, whether all the nests have fledged. So yes, these haying timelines cover our whole geography, but that's the caveat that we're adding to the contract to allow for more geographic variation.
So we have some grassland bird conservationists from Wisconsin who say they delay cutting their 20-acre hayfield till the second week of July. So I would imagine that timelines could vary from New England to the Midwest, correct?
Certainly, yeah.
They also commented that they have an adjoining 20-acre field that is in native grass cover, which I assume, having gone to school in Iowa, they're talking about prairie grasses. And they say that their bobolinks seem to prefer their active hay field for nesting, but that they use the native grassland once off the nest. Is that something you could speak to?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We don't have a lot of native prairie here, so I haven't been able to really see that side-by-side comparison, but in a lot of ways, it's not surprising. They really love, you know, managed hayfields, and it's because they're fertilized and they're cut so that there's a lot of vigor in the grass, and it's really a healthy grass community. And I think that's kind of the problem, because it really replicates native prairie, but maybe is even more appealing. We're still kind of trying to understand the cues that they use to select those sites, whether it's like when they're greening up or how they appear kind of in that early period of May. So different forage mixes also can have an impact on how grassland species are using fields. Yeah, so that's a really interesting observation, and something that I'd love to look into more.
So everyone, I want to, we're almost at time. I'm going to keep asking Hyla some of the remaining questions that people had. But if you feel like jumping off, it's almost 7:30. I just want to thank everyone for attending. And we will have another program next month. I will actually be talking about my graduate research in birds and coffee, so bird-friendly coffee. If you're familiar with that, if you're not, you should attend the talk, but that information will be up on our website. And so thank you for coming. I will keep asking Hyla some questions. And so feel free to add some more questions in the chat if you still have them. Okay, so someone mentioned in reference to high quality hay fields, how many nesting pairs, I assume they mean bobolinks, could one ideally expect?
That's a great question, and one that I don't have an easy answer for. They're semi-colonial nesters. So oftentimes when you see or hear a bobolink in a field, there are probably a lot of them. I don't have our data in front of me, so I can't say like what the average number of pairs would be in each field, but certainly, as you get larger fields, you'll have more. And as the quality increases, you'll also have more pairs because there's just a greater density of food resources in that field. So I would have to do a little bit of digging, I think, in our data in order to really be able to answer that question. But it's a really good one. I'll actually write it down and look into that.
You also spoke about the challenges about woody encroachment, but someone mentioned that they'd observed that male bobolinks seem to like to have a perch. So is there sort of a balancing act there?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And that's interesting because a lot of the recommendations will say to remove hedgerows and remove trees in the fields. I think there's definitely a sweet spot where in some of the fields that I've monitored, I've really noticed the highest concentrations of birds, sometimes clustered around, small woody obstacles, like whether it's one big tree, probably slightly less likely, but especially when there are a couple shrubs, they definitely forage in them and they perch on them. And I think some of those recommendations were coming more from the Great Plains states, where the idea was if there was going to be a red-tailed hawk perching somewhere, it would be perching in that tree, and it might be the only tree for, quite some distance. So it would be not wise to build your nest near that tree. Whereas in the East Coast, there are so many trees for predators to perch in that the chance that it will perch in that one is so much smaller. So I think I personally think it's a smaller risk to those birds in the East. And so they've actually started to utilize some woody trees, to their advantage, which is pretty interesting. And that's another example of how management recommendations really vary geographically.
So you mentioned fertilization is important, or seems to be important. Is it primarily nitrogen additions that are the most useful, or could a greater proportion of legumes be a substitute for fertilizers?
Yeah, so legumes are great. And there are kind of two issues, which is nutrient content and then soil acidity. And as soils get more acidic, you have fewer nutrients and you'll have fewer legumes. So, you know, soil amendments and fertilization kind of go hand in hand. Nitrogen fertilizing often really makes soils more acidic. So we would recommend, you know, organic fertilizers, like composted manure or even having livestock in the field. So when we went to Shelburne Farms, something that I found to be really interesting was that the dairy manager, Sam, was telling us that he just moves livestock through this one field where he was kind of seeing a transition of vegetation occurring. He moves them through for about a month every fall. And just to have that much, you know, natural manure on the field, it was really turning around the field quality. So it doesn't even need to be that much. And I would say, you know, the more natural you can be, the better. But grasslands really always evolved alongside grazers. So they're a really important part of a grassland system. And just finding a way to kind of replicate that is pretty essential for the fields.
Okay, and I realize we're running over time here now. So we have a bunch more questions. I'm gonna let our last question be our first question asker. And I would encourage any other question askers to email Hyla at that address. So Dawn asks about milkweed plants and trying to balance allowing milkweed pods to burst and not mowing till the late fall. But it sounds like from what you've told us that there's maybe a challenge with mowing too late. So could you speak to balancing pollinator habitat and grassland bird habitat?
Yeah, this is a great question. I had a really interesting site visit where this really came up. And it was basically a field that was kind of succeeding more into pollinator habitat. In my mind, I kind of think of them as two separate management plans, because obviously we need milkweed, we need monarchs, but when you're mowing that late, the field just inevitably is also going to be overrun by goldenrods, which are also great for pollinators. But it's just like, I would put my money on it that if you're managing it on a timeline that lets, you know, milkweed go to seed, it will slowly, you'll see a decline in bobolink abundance just because of the change in vegetation composition that happens. So I would say for anyone that's interested in pollinator habitat, you could select a part of your field that you want to dedicate more as pollinator habitat. You know, areas along the edges of fields are great for that because bobolinks won't nest close to edges. So just kind of maintaining the center, if you have a large enough field that you can kind of let the edges go a little bit, that can be a great way to balance it. Or, you know, if you have a wetter area, milkweed are going to thrive in wetter areas and bobolinks won't really nest there. So you could mow that later. Sometimes like the lower part of the field won't have as many bobolinks in it because they tend to like the upper parts of the field, the higher elevation areas. So yeah, I wouldn't manage the whole field and expect to have both, but you can definitely kind of make that decision and let pollinators thrive just in a separate part of the field.
Great.
Well, we're on a smaller field, like a less than 20 acre field.
Perfect. Jeff and I are turning our cameras back on to wish everyone a good night, to thank Hyla for an amazing talk. Please reach out to her with any additional questions. And please, if you aren't subscribed to our email list, that is where we will notify you, or you can follow us on Facebook of future Green Mountain Audubon Society events, both in person and online. And with that, thank you all so much for coming. This was a great first program.
Yeah, thanks, Hyla. Great program. Liza, thanks for facilitating. And
Thanks
thanks
for having
everybody
me.
for your attention.
Good night, everyone.